Namaste everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of Bharat Varta. We often hear of the numerous challenges and opportunities in our financial system, but the brightest ray of hope is in the realm of fintech innovation. And to discuss this vibrant and thriving space, we have with us Monica Jasuja and Mandar Kagade, two experts in the field. Monica is the head of product for mobile financial services at Comviva. She's an industry veteran with nearly 2 decades' experience in such companies as PayPal and MasterCard. Thanks so much for joining us, Monica.
Thank you for inviting me.
Mandar is a fintech public policy consultant. He was formerly head of policy at Crediton and Catalyst, which is a USAID funded digital payments initiative. It'll be interesting to understand from him how fintechs are navigating through the regulatory framework. Welcome to the podcast, Mandar. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so there's plenty to talk about because there's plenty happening in this space. Maybe we'll begin with you, Monica. If you could help us understand, the nature of fintech innovation in India, both on the product and the distribution side of things.
Absolutely. So India is the beacon and the ray of hope that I think for all of fintech all across the world. But I think recently in the last year itself, we've seen India is the second most heavily invested in terms of fintech. Having said that, while the areas which are typically get a lot of focus tend to be around the wallets, etc., which has always been a wave that happened over the last couple of years. Now, I think there is a slight more expansion in terms of areas and segments that we are looking at, and therefore what has caused a lot of interest amongst the VC community. But what I really find interesting is two specific areas that VCs are really interested in right now, which is credit, both on the consumer as well as on the merchant side, and of course, personal finance management and investment management solutions, both of which have already taken off. And the offshoots of that happened in the last 2 years, where you saw a lot of fintechs get investment, specifically on being able to solve some other problems, which is being able to manage money or being able to manage investments, which is not something that one would customarily find with a economy such as ours. But then that also leads to the fact that also tells us a little bit about how VCs are thinking about broadening the pyramid of users who are both on digital and using digital payments. Payments has been the test bed of all kind of both global and local companies coming in. But I hope that we have gone beyond payments and fintech as it exists, which is financial technology, start seeing the uptake that we've always been expecting, but never really seen it happen in India.
Right. So there are 2 or 3 different threads that I want to pick up on with what you said. So one is, let's say, services on the consumer side, which could be, around financial inclusion, last mile, and so on. It could also be around, let's say, value-added services or credit, as you mentioned. It could also be, banking or core technology itself, right, to help banks and insurance companies and financial services companies serve their end customers better. So how do you see all of this coming together, and what is the evolution you've seen? Some of the companies that are doing great work as well. I mean, if you could mention them. Sorry, that's a very wide question, I know.
I know, I was going to say that, and everybody is going to hate me for answering it the way I will. But banks, everybody said banks will get killed because fintech came in, and now fintechs are partnering with banks. And the ones that are actually partnering with the banks and the networks are actually ranked as unicorns and above, and are being bought over. So suddenly everybody's gone back to working with fintechs instead of working against fintechs, and fintechs also doing the same. So unfortunately, maybe I'm old or maybe I'm a traditionalist, but I really feel that everybody needs to work together in the ecosystem for anything good to happen, whether it is financial inclusion, which is broadening the base of the pyramid and actually reaching and having financial services reach those who are actually the underserved, or reaching those who are actually the well-served and at the same time are the cynosure of everybody's eyes. Having said that, as far as banks are concerned, I think banks have some problems to solve, and I think we've spent reams of papers just talking about why banks either are going to die or they don't seem to exist, they don't seem to innovate. But at the end of the day, they are solving a problem, and that problem itself is actually broadening because of the technology divide that is now being created between the haves and the have-nots. So if you think about the problem that we are trying to solve, the problem itself has changed and has evolved. Therefore, banks have to work with fintechs because fintechs offer both easy access as well as innovative capabilities that banks may not within the regulatory gambit be able to solve. Having said that, in India, to answer the question in terms of what is being done and how the evolution is happening, while the Aadhaar and the India Stack has actually democratized both information, access, as well as availability, and therefore use of and consumer data and consumers being the fulcrum of all innovation. I think what is also changing is because of the India Stack, a lot of the services that are being built on top of it, which uses this as a black box and probably also as an innovation layer, is something that is actually broadening the horizons of what fintechs can do in India as compared to, say, 5 years ago, where this was not existing. Having said that, the regulatory environment doesn't really help when there's a flip-flop. And I'm sure Mandar will be able to speak to this better and should elaborate, where because of the flip-flop environment, fintech innovates and then they are hit by regulatory challenges, and then it's 2 steps forward and many steps backward. Now, because of that, banks seem to win in this small little race that we are seeing, which is a snapshot of time, 3 to 5 years. But if you look at the longer and the bigger picture of what is going to emerge, fintechs will continue to innovate on those use cases that are going to take these services to much, much beyond what a bank's reach is ever going to be, not in terms of consumers, but in terms of consumer behavior changes that are needed for payments to grow and transaction behaviors to become digital. But at the same time, banks are going to be also the stepping stone for fintechs to be able to create and to be able to operate within the regulatory gambit that banks can provide. And I know that there have been a few cases with a couple of banks going bust and obviously the complete infrastructure needed to shift. But then it brings forward the same questions that we've always had in product, which is, do you have a single point of failure? How do you build redundancy into the system? What do you need to do in order to be able to serve better and bigger and scale? And that's what banks have been doing for many number of years. So in India, if I see Paytm, for example, I don't see and look at it as a financial technology company. I look at it as a much bigger conglomerate, which kind of encompasses and brings in elements of both business, finance, financial technology, payments, e-commerce, and everything else. I hate to call it a super app because I think the entities and the legal guidance that they have, therefore, makes them a conglomerate business, not just a single super app, which kind of marries elements and brings them in. And Paytm is a prime example because it's obviously one of the top 10 most highly funded companies in the world. So obviously one must talk about it. But having said that, there are many other companies ranging from both wealth management to insurance tech to actually regulatory tech, which have actually emerged in just the last 10 years. And if you just look at the landscape, you'd be able to guess that most of these companies have not just innovated, they have actually built stable businesses, and some of them are actually beta positive. So we tend to lose that sight of that bigger picture because we tend to think fintech is all about valuation, but fintech is also about making money. And the companies that are making money are very few and far between, but they have a revenue business model in this very large crowded ecosystem to actually stand the test of time. So I'm actually more happy about that and them actually working with large operators in the market to be able to create something of significance, which I think will outlive the test of that 5-10 years. That is a typical startup time for it to be successful.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you. I think if you look back at maybe 10 years back, there was this whole fantasy that, technology companies will become banks sooner than banks can adopt technology, but that has sort of not happened, right? So, and I definitely want to come back to, how some of the incumbents are responding and, how they're keeping up. But before that, Mandar, I want to ask you how policymakers, how the government itself is responding to this. I mean, you can see that the pace of innovation is so fast and rapid. How are these guys trying to keep up with regulations and so on?
So no, when you say policymakers, I would include policymakers in India would also include regulators, principally because if you see the vast expanse of governing laws, they have a wide margin of discretion. So most policy is also made by regulators in India. So to come to your question, there is a Chinese proverb which Dr. Rajan, when he was the governor, he was fond of using. I think he used it in a Financial Express interview. He said regulators, in India, he said we cross the rivers by feeling the stones. Mostly, policymakers sort of encapsulate that reasoning in their actions so far as financial innovation in India is concerned. So if you see, they've been very proactive in terms of enabling removal of friction, enabling innovation on the credit origination side of things, in terms of enabling compliances like KYC and the like through Aadhaar, as also presenceless. Recently, if you notice, there is a additional innovation on that front in terms of enabling presenceless Aadhaar through video KYC and the like. There is the other part where they've sort of intervened recently is the new umbrella entity framework, where they basically said that, look, we understand that Paytm is NPCI is this umbrella payments entity in India, and UPI has scaled well and the like. But we want to induce and inject some competition in the ecosystem through a new umbrella entity framework. And so they sort of laid out the framework, and you can read in the business press that a bunch of entities, including some bellwether payment networks and payment sector professionals, are sort of interested in sort of applying to the under the NUE framework and sort of starting their own payment system. So other than that, you see, I mean, that's for the what I might call the conventional fintech space, right? But if you see the the frontier fintech space, like blockchain and digital assets and the like, in that space, regulators are much more sort of slow to adapt to change and the like. And if you see the global developments insofar as digital assets and blockchain is concerned, we moved on from 2009 through 2020, and people are sort of countries and jurisdictions around the world have regulatory frameworks governing digital assets. But India is sort of it's sort of watching the space, and if you see the recent developments, people regulators and policymakers are they're slow to adapt. They're studying the space and the like, including especially as mentioned in the 2017 Committee of Ministries report. I'm not too sure if that's the name, but it was headed by the then Finance Secretary, Mr. Garg. And they said that, look, let's watch the space and the like. So, there are two limbs. So far as the conventional fintech as we know, is concerned, regulators and policymakers are very proactive through Aadhaar's, enabling Aadhaar stack, as also through other means, like, in the payment space, like I mentioned, the NUE framework. But when it comes to real frontier space, there's steady to adopt it, right? They're studying the ecosystem. There is also, they're also studying the, stable coins and CBDCs, which is basically a subset of stable coins, right? So that is basically the, lay of the land so far as policymakers are concerned.
Right. So do you see things changing with that frontier tech that you mentioned? I mean, do you see, let's say, the crypto ban being removed sometime, or things to that effect?
I think we are a little further away from that. There is although they are actively listening to stakeholders, but I think we are a little further away from from changing the status quo. In that context, you will recall that in March earlier this year, just before the COVID situation sort of hit our shores, we had a Supreme Court rule on a particular RBI notification. That was a catalyst to sort of for the policymakers to think about this, and they are actively engaged with stakeholders insofar as what's the best way of regulating digital assets and enabling blockchain in India is concerned. But we are a little further away from having a framework in place.
Right. So Monica, I want to come back to the incumbent's response, right? Recently, I mean, I read this article in, I think it was Angela Strange of Andreessen Horowitz, who I think she wrote it a while back. She argued basically that every company will be a fintech company, you know.
Yes.
So where banks will perhaps act as a regulatory box and expose APIs, and then, you know, every startup or whatever will build services because they're best equipped to serve customers as such. Given all of these radical ideas and so on, how have you know, banks and insurers done up until now, and how do you see their role going forward as well?
So I actually totally agree with this whole idea. I was reading about this, and I also think that most companies are taking to this whole APIfication. And I know it kind of sounds almost simplistic, too rudimentary to even look at it as a technology fad. But having said that, there is a reason why it's all happening. And if you look at the larger networks, for example, investing in API first infrastructures in order to be able to not only be able to expand and scale their services, but exist and coexist with data aggregators, for example, it shows that there is a certain trend moving towards being able to build black box kind of infrastructure and therefore build platform layers which are going to make it easier for the outside world to be able to, first of all, not replicate. Second, make sure that this continues to remain like an interoperable world instead of building these small little islands that seem to excellently operate within that small little gambit. But when it comes to making things global and making sure that you're able to, for example, reduce the cost of innovation at the same time reduce the cost of services, then it becomes a necessary inhibitor, which we've seen in the India case with UPI. Now, the bigger thing, however, is that with this APIfication happening, what will become most important is for each of the banks and each of the incumbents within the ecosystem, which is not just the banks. There are multiple ecosystem partners. They need to actually move towards this new platformification, as we call it. And that means a completely new paradigm. To think API first, to think digital first. And when we talk about digital, people always talk about the mobile phone and anything that you can see, which seems to be a device, but it's not about that. Digital actually, and because of COVID, we've actually seen a digital transformation even in terms of customer service, and it's not just bots. So the question is, how do you become more digitally transformed and therefore enable services to actually be enabled digital first, which means that there are going to be consumers, and a consumer in the ecosystem can be somebody from within the bank, which is actually another, say, a card or a prepaid or any other management system, or even a digital banking application. Or it could be an outside party like a fintech, which is actually much more agile and nimble to be able to create use cases that are actually able to create the scale that we are looking for. So if you look at Google and the likes of the big global players coming into India, India was the land of opportunity always, because let's be honest, we have the largest population in the world next only to China, and we're an open economy that way. But the question is, have we really fulfilled the promise that both digital payments as it exists, because that's the first frontier everybody wants to win, followed by what needs to happen? And the answer is no. But then the UPI integrations have actually shown that banks have a major role to play along with the networks. And I also feel with other incumbents that have yet not so far surfaced. And which is, for example, credit systems and bureaus, and being able to establish an identity and a transaction layer which provides reliability in the network, which we don't have right now. Now, the question is whether it's going to be an India government / regulatory body that is going to push for an OCEN kind of network, and which is actually going to create this effect, or whether there are going to be others who want to participate. And I think Mandar said this very well, with the NUE coming in, the question is which private player would like to participate and actually build. And when we talk about building infrastructure, it's a long-term play. So when you start building infrastructure, you're going to have to partner with multiple ecosystem partners. And when you start partnering with banks, you'll also be hit by how slow or how fast they move. So I actually feel that banks are not only here to stay, I actually feel that banks are going to be the major fulcrum for how all innovation is going to happen. It may be slower than we would anticipate, but I think how Indian banks are reacting is much better than, say, in the US, where even a basic single transfer, for example, was a major problem that got highlighted in COVID-19, because there was no way to actually send money. the way it happens in India. And I think we tend to underestimate what we've been able to achieve simply because we keep talking about that top of the pyramid, which is those anywhere between 300 million users to 500 million users which are on digital. Well, life really extends a lot beyond that. It's not about how many people are using WhatsApp. It's about how many people are actually going digital, which means accessing services which are actually meant for them. And I think the biggest success that we've had in the last 6 months, and I know people are going to hate me for saying this, is the social benefits that actually went across to the many underprivileged, and it didn't create the kind of headlines that it should have created in the market. Because had this happened in any other more developed country, people would be talking realms, like there would be hours on the internet just devoted to how amazing an ecosystem has been built, where the financially underprivileged have not been let down. And we already have that. So we actually have to talk about much more bigger advancements that need to come out.
Can I just quickly come in on the quickly come in on the API, banks partnering with fintechs through API, ecosystem, sort of opening up their APIs to, partner fintechs, right? I think part of the reason why we haven't seen it pick up as much as we should have, although I know that there are a few banks that are experimenting with that model, is also the regulatory setup. If you see the regulatory and policy setup, because RBI regulates entity-wise, and entity-wise it regulates banks and NBFCs, for instance. So any vendor ecosystem, RBI exerts its influence through these entities because it cannot, by its statute, extend its regulatory, jurisdiction to fintech vendors. So what it does is there are some guidelines that the RBI has laid down in about 2012 and from there on. And that basically ensures that banks are the liability holder and partner ecosystems are managed through that counterparty monitor, right? And bank being the counterparty, bank or NBFC as the case might be. So, that kind of liability ecosystem makes banks a little risk averse in terms of, offloading that, partnering and opening up their black box, so to speak, to sort of fintechs for experimentation and the like, because they know that, if the reputational cost as also the regulatory cost, the actual sort of, they might get their license suspended, or, they may not be able to raise deposits and the like. I mean, RBI Act and the Banking Regulation Act, wide powers, rest with the RBI to sort of, punish bad behavior. So there's sort of that risk aversion that we, that's also a drag on, faster APIization of banking services.
Right. Yeah. So
I have actually a classic case in point though, which happened, I think, in the start last year, I think, about the tokenization framework. So the likes of Apple Pay, Google Pay, Samsung Pay, and the rest of and coming into India, classic example where the banks are going to be held liable along with a quasi-network, I would say quasi-regulatory role that the networks are going to play. But the question is, the third parties which are actually providing that are not under the gambit of either a provider or therefore under the gambit of the RBI to play by the rules. So the question really becomes, when you hold that liability associated with both innovation as well as brand and many other risks, including financial risks, you really have barriers to opening up your infrastructure to many. So you'll obviously be very risk averse. And when you start doing that, you're obviously going to throttle innovation. I think that's a basic side effect that happens. But having said that, that's the gambit of what we are operating in. And even then, I think we are doing really well, and it will only continue to go better.
That's true. That's true.
Right. Right. So Mandar, much of the innovation hinges on the JAM Trinity, the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and mobile Trinity. Do you want to talk a little bit about the vision and also the impact that it's had?
So, I think, a good analogy will be, to think about the JAM Trinity as the base layer, the infrastructure on which one might say even the protocol layer as it's called, right? And on which, private sector is sort of innovating, right? What does JAM enable? JAM enables a connection between your Jan Dhan account which is like a basic no-frills bank account that the government, by virtue of being a principal shareholder in about 70% of the banking ecosystem, a little less than 70%, has said, okay, let's have those accounts to otherwise financially excluded population segment of the population, and connecting that Jan Dhan account to mobile and to Aadhaar. Right now, that basically, that connection, that sort of linkage, along with what we know as the Aadhaar stack, has sort of provided the base layer on which people have innovated. And as you know, Aadhaar stack comprises of the document layer and the identity layer and so on and so forth, and the payments layer in the UPI. And both the digital KYC and the payments layer have scaled spectacularly well. I mean, we see the volumes in billions, right, in terms of transactions and the like. So I mean, yeah, a lot of Philip, right? It's like the early days of internet when it was ARPANET, right? Internet, when it came around in about mid-70s or so, if my memory serves right, it was basically a collaboration between private sector and the public sector. And sort of, we seem to have found that that golden middle where private sector is sort of innovating on top of that base layer that is JAM.
Right. So Monica, I mean, I wanted to contrast our ecosystem with ecosystems outside. It could be Singapore or San Francisco. I know for a fact that digital payments here are just miles ahead of anywhere else, right? I mean, it's so archaic in the US, for example. But at the same time, I mean, you have startups like Stripe in the US that are doing some pretty interesting work and, helping out merchants, incorporating companies, etc. Right? Could you just compare and contrast, all of these different fintech ecosystems?
So, I've worked in the US. I've used to work with PayPal. So therefore, I've been part of that whole growth curve. But having said that, I think the digitization that happened in these countries has actually propelled innovation in a way that it's been able to work along with the incumbents, but to be able to actually offer and serve some consumer needs. I don't know whether in emerging economies or even in Southeast Asia, for example, there are such needs that we actually want to cater to. And I say this, with a great amount of trepidation, because it sounds like innovation means that you should be able to create something new. But whatever you create, there should be users to use it. So when you think about a Singapore, for example, which has 3.9 million working, professionals, they would need the kind of solutions that you have, which is robo-advisory and your money making money. But imagine if this 1% of that taxpayer base in India, how many products will you continue to throw at them, and how many will actually stick? So, I'm going back to this very nice article which I read, and I can't remember which paper it was, but I think a couple of second-time founders in India had said that it's actually easier to make money of that 1% taxpayer base, which is the top of the pyramid, simply because they're going to be able to pay for services, and there is no other problem that they're trying to solve here, able to serve the needs which they already have, which are being served, but do it better. So therefore, create an experiential layer, which will probably lead to not only high valuations for them, and obviously Cred and Indwealth and the rest of the gambit, prime examples of that. And they are very clear that we are actually trying to solve the problems of the wealthy. But now the question is, if you're trying to solve the problems of them, then what happens to the other sides of the population? Do they not need what we're asking them to do? And it kind of comes back to the proverbial question, which is in India, cash is really cheap, and at the same time, cash is really convenient. So what are we trying to solve for? So a Stripe can solve the problem of merchant businesses who don't have the wherewithal to be able to, say, get simple or hard or soft cost solutions and be able to solve that problem, because everybody is used to paying with a card. But I don't know whether we have those problems here. And therefore, Singapore, I was thinking through this before I came to this debate. And Singapore, for example, has become the testbed of all innovation, including math, which actually supports innovation and is at the front lines of actually creating a spirit as well as a culture of both innovation practices as well as actually front-ending fintechs, which need this help. Now, the question is, are we behind them? I don't think so. What they are, what propels them forward as compared to us is the whole environment in Singapore, which is generally very business friendly. So Singapore is the headquarter or the with more industries than I know of. And the reason why they are headquartered there and they have the regional headquarters there is because of the very friendly environment. Now the same kind of percolates down to innovation and therefore also to fintech. Because a lot of the fintech companies there are not doing something which is quite extraordinary. They're just doing it better and faster. And because they're able to do it at a faster pace, we think that the pace of innovation is outpacing us in India. I don't think that's the case. We have to operate within the strict gambit of regulation, and therefore we become a little slower. But I don't think in the long term, we would be very far behind. In fact, would be ahead thing. However, having said that, the government, and I must compliment the RBI, for example, they've opened up a sandbox, regulatory sandbox. Now, how many would have thought a couple of years ago that the RBI would be at the front line? Now, one must give them credit for where it's due. And the Babu culture that normally exists in India outside, it may exist in the RBI as far as doing due diligence is concerned. But for a country like ours, which is 1 billion people, whatever you do, you need to have due diligence around it. If you don't have that framework, you can't operate a payment system that goes down. In the same way, you can't start a payment system that doesn't cater to the needs of everyone. I remember this very famous, and Mandar, I'm sure you would agree, if you ever went down to the RBI, even if you were having chai, everybody said, what problem are you trying to solve? If you showed them your phone, they said, that's not the problem we are trying to solve. Who's going to solve the problem of that person who has that Nokia? Because that's the handset, that's the population that they are looking at. And I hope that we try to understand that I think we are not doing as bad as people try to imagine us to be doing. It's only that we have to do things a little slower than other people. Yeah. Mandar, would you agree?
Yes. I have a couple of points to add, if Roshan will permit.
Sure.
So you mentioned the contrast, right? So I mean, the way I think about slightly, I firstly completely agree with Monica. And the way I think about these three jurisdictions where San Francisco becomes, I'm sort of metaphorizing San Francisco as the US ecosystem, Singapore as one more, as sort of another parallel, in India, right? So India tends to be cooperative, and this goes to also to the point that you mentioned previously about the nature of innovation in India. So fintech innovation in India is very cooperative, where, as Monica mentioned earlier, banks and fintechs partner rather than disrupt, each other, and then sort of, take off. Say, for instance, fintechs then solve for the origination layer of it, right? And then, the underwriting happens on the bank's, ecosystem, in the bank's ecosystem, and so on and so forth. So there is that, cooperation as a model in India. You contrast that with Singapore. As Monica mentioned, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is their central bank and sort of the unified regulator there, what I call it is managed innovation, where it is at the forefront of enabling, sort of acting as a catalyst and the like. And if you see their regulatory sandbox, they recently came out with the Payment Services Act of 2020, which entered into force around May this year, where they basically, recognize digital payment tokens and the like. So it's very forward-looking sort of act, and sort of recognizing innovation in this space, and sort of very aligned to making Singapore the hub of fintech innovation in the region. And then there is the US, where companies like Kabbage and San Francisco, right? Kabbage and Plaid and the like are sort of looking to sort of disrupt and that's the nomenclature that they sort of want to push, right? Disrupt and the ecosystem of incumbents, right? Coming from the West Coast, so to speak, to the state, Wall Street, and sort of the banks that happen to be on the East Coast. Right. So there are these three models. One is the managed innovation model, which is in Singapore, the cooperation model that we see in India, and the disruption as a metaphor / model that is sort of, coming through from the US.
Right. So Mandar, I want to come back to something that Monica mentioned earlier, which is that, startups are content building for that creamy layer, right? So the top 1%. And it's understandable because there's just so much of white space in that. If you look at it, right, less than 5% of India invests in equities. Probably less than 20% of us have insurance in India, right? So they may well, build solutions for those people. But then, given the government's emphasis on financial inclusion, what are they doing specifically to incentivize, entrepreneurs and startups to start building for the last mile, solving the last mile problem?
Yeah, so this is actually sort of a well-known debate that sort of you go to every fintech conference and this comes up, like, are we building for what we know as Bharat, right? I mean, or are we only building for people like us, for want of a better expression, which are sort of urbanized, educated, can handle mobile, are digitally native, and so on and so forth, right? But thankfully, I've seen business models. So I've attended pitch conferences in the past a year or so, and one can see several business models sort of being pitched. I'll just sort of walk you through those business models and sort of give you a brief flavor of how regulatory ecosystem is also trying to bridge that Bharat India gap, right? So to begin with, the account aggregator framework that RBI has recently notified, which will basically be operationalized, I think, in the next 2 months. I think yesterday or today, Bloomberg Quint reported that few banks, private sector banks, are looking to partner with account aggregator NBFCs to roll out their services in the next 8 weeks or so, right? So that basically is a layer which serves credit in an unsecured way, right, for businesses, for instance, because what it does, it gives account and asset visibility of a particular borrower. It could be business, it could be a personal, sort of retail kind of borrower, and it gives that visibility to what the ecosystem known as the financial information user. Basically, think about financial information user as any new age bank, and they basically use that account aggregation pipe to get data from the existing sort of banks, and basis that, use that data, crunch that data through their models and the like, and sort of then make that unsecured loan, for instance, right? So that is one way. That's sort of a good recent innovation that has come up, and that will sort of aid the otherwise financially excluded segment, right? Because small businesses, they don't have a credit score, and they mostly have to then rely on informal money markets at 35%, 40% interest rate, and that becomes a vicious cycle because they get trapped into that, what we know as a debt trap, right? So, I mean, these basically, by enabling these, what I might say, real-time credit assessment through mechanisms like account aggregator, is sort of building for them. So that's one business model that has come up. Then, then there is also some innovation happening on the agri-finance segment, right? So I know this fintech that is using blockchain to enable warehouse financing. Warehouse is basically, the title document for goods and goods that that a farmer might take to the mandi and the like. And basically, that sort of they use blockchain technology to keep tabs on how the title to the document moves, and sort of is negotiated that way, right? And so basically, that's the way it's a bit like discounting for how you discount invoice in supply chain finance. It's the same model, except that it's a warehouse finance receipt, which is a title document for farmers. So you have innovation around that. So that's also sort of because agri finance is sort of excluded and the like, and otherwise full of friction, because you don't know how you're going to fund. They also have similar problems as micro business, small and micro business men, right?
No, nobody offers them loans, right? I mean, so recently, I mean, I read about ICICI offering loans based on satellite data. I mean, it was,
Correct. Yeah. They've sort of innovated that basically make correct, because the vagaries of nature and the like play a role there, right? Because the risk there for credit to be for any credit given to farmers is tough. So these sorts of models, which are basically trade finance models, right? The warehouse financing model is a trade finance model applied to agriculture, and those models are also coming up. Then you see others like UPI, basically leveraging UPI and like. You see micro ERP solutions being provided. There are some fintechs that are working with that sort of leveraging the GST ecosystem, because now about about 20 million or so businesses are are within the GST ambit, and you need digitization to sort of to help them comply, and basically because they want to, they are subject to GST, they have to comply and sort of keep records and the like. So there are micro ERP solutions which can then sort of feed into credit assessment, right? By opening up, let's say banks sort of suck that data and then sort of crunch that data and build that build whatever your sales and revenue and the like, and sort of the ecosystem that you sell to frequently, your the sort of the ebb and flow of business and the like. Those data points can then feed into the bank's ecosystem and the like. So there are models being built around that micro ERP and the like. So yeah, I mean we've moved on from just building for the haves, for want of a better expression, and sort of we moved to the Bharat layer of it. And I think the point, the infrastructure that I mentioned earlier, Jam, Trinity, Aadhaar stack, as also the account aggregator framework, as also blockchain technology and the like, all are being leveraged, as I pointed out, and those several models are sort of pushing their way into what we know as Bharat, and innovating using fintech to sort of offer last mile solutions to them.
Right. So, Monica, I mean, at the other end, we have the millennials and the Gen Zs, the urban janta, right, who are sort of fintech first. I mean, the classic example I can think of was, there was a large bank whose mobile app was down for a couple of days, and they put out they just put out a statement, very dry reading statement. And then, you have the likes of, let's say, Zerodha or whoever, whose CEO is on Twitter answering every question, right? I mean, so it kind of shows the contrast in the approach to the service itself. So these Gen Zs who are fintech first, how are startups and entrepreneurs sort of serving these folks?
Well, the fact of the matter is they are serving the folks by innovating on either existing functions that were already there, or by actually what I call them is transformation of customer experience and building something which is so intuitive and easy to use. Therefore, it actually takes the friction away from a typical payment experience or a typical merchant experience. And that is what is winning the day. So imagine if a couple of years earlier you had told somebody, don't use your credit card and use your bank account instead, nobody would have actually used it. But now we're in the process where we're using our bank account more than ever. So what the banks have always struggled with is debit card activation. And now everybody is actually using their bank account to make payments. So who would have thought this would have happened? So this is a classic case in which, because of the familiarity and therefore the ease of access that a mobile device provides, you've been able to actually transform the customer experience layer and therefore be able to appeal to those who are not interested in real, sitting behind a laptop screen or a computer screen and trying to make things happen. They want things fast, they want them now. And they also have that element of social status and pride attached to how quickly they can do things, what the others are doing. And therefore, I actually feel that because of the global players now coming in, and with India, not China, and I'm saying that again, India actually being at the forefront, allowing social media platforms to actually be able to enable financial services and therefore banking services and everything else which is happening because of, for example, WhatsApp business, is all happening on the mobile. Now, imagine you're actually not only appealing to the digital first customer who doesn't wish to have an interaction over a phone with a customer executive. They're more happy chatting. And this seems counterintuitive to those of us who've been in that stage where, talking to somebody and having face-to-face interaction always seems to solve problems. But then the question is, we're actually moving away. And therefore, it's more important that when fintechs are looking at what are they trying to solve, sometimes they're actually trying to solve problems that have always existed but never seemed important enough. Suddenly now, those are actually front and center of all innovation. And let's talk about the zero friction experience on payments, for example. It's always existed. Each one of us is very happy with our SMSs coming in, but suddenly there's a need for everybody to do it without any clicks, and everybody to do it seamlessly, and everybody to do it with a 4-digit PIN. And suddenly you have UPI, which made it mainstream. Now everybody wants to follow the same thing. So I think the question is, like with the Gen Z and the millennials, a lot of them are actually focused not on saving time as much as it's about the experience and to be able to do the things that are not only cool, but actually help them save both time as well as effort in doing that. As long as we're able to accomplish that, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the spot. Having said that, I haven't seen innovation that has gone beyond making things more convenient. And just because a CEO is on Twitter, and I absolutely appreciate Nitin's insights, so of course as Kunal as well. But I must ask the question, because somebody is not doing that does not mean that they're not trying to make their business make money for their shareholding community. Probably they're doing it in a different way, and they have people who actually manage that. But this is just a way of looking at things. And this is just my perspective. Personally, I don't prefer if the CEO of a company sat on Twitter all day long, I would have a serious problem because I wouldn't invest in that company. That's just me.
Yeah. No, I mean, aside from the customer experience, I mean, you also have these new products and instruments that are being made accessible, right? So Zerodha, for example, has a very large range of, I think, 200 plus products that they've made accessible to these new class of investors.
I was going to say absolutely no doubt. However, having said that, without quoting the source, just in the last few weeks, we've had so much investment going into mutual funds, except the problem is with all these new digital mediums, the investments that are happening are very small ticket size, which actually means people are doing it without understanding how a market actually and a stock market actually works. Therefore, the money that they are not only earning with a lot of hard work, they are putting into an instrument that they don't even know how it will operate over a period of time. That actually worries me more than it actually excites me. And the reason for the excitement, for the lack of excitement, is only because we're not actually enabling people to understand both how fintech works, what they are supposed to be do to be able to be secure, and therefore, nobody actually mentions how many frauds actually happen, and they get wiped under the carpet because the larger institutions always get under the scanner because of one person whose account got hacked. But what happens to the millions of fintechs whose data is available on the dark web? And there are millions of examples where it makes it to the internet and then it just gets washed out on the carpet because everybody says, it's a growing company, it happens. But if it happened to a large scale organization, you can imagine the ramifications that it would have. So I would say a balance is definitely needed, and I wouldn't be so excited because people are investing in the market because of a product. They're probably trying to use it and understand how it works. I'm more worried, and therefore I would be more excited in maybe 3 years' time as to how many new investors we created, and I know Zerodha will be able to do that. I have absolutely no doubt Policybazaar and Bank Bazaar and the rest of the good marketplaces are going to be able to enhance both insurance tech and therefore the availability as well as the viability of insurance. And I have my own ideas and my personal experience with insurance. But having said that, if the insurance base increases and the number of insured actually increases, does it mean that it will reduce something else in the system, which is how many of them will be able to claim insurance just as easily? I don't think the answer is yes right now. I really don't think so.
Can I just quickly chime in on this? Yeah. So Monica's point is valid, and I think that brings the whole business model around personal finance management, right? PFM. To the forefront. And India, does not have a whole lot of PFM products. There may be some, but we've yet to reach a phase where PFM becomes important. And if you notice, recently RBI put out a national strategy for financial education document through a financial literacy body that RBI, IRDA, and SEBI coordinate together. I think financial literacy and financial education are going to be as we make products for Gen Z and the like, because they might be digital native as we all are, but financial literacy and financial education is a different thing. So if you log in, you need to understand if interest rates move up or down, then how does it impact option, right? And what is the difference between option and a future, right? So otherwise you'd get your burned. You're not looking at you're not looking at and them sort of disabling. Both have to go together.
A very prime example happened a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah,
Sorry, I think I was just saying that a couple of weeks ago in the US, a very famous fintech startup actually was in the news for all the wrong reasons for exactly the behavior. Without naming them, And that's exactly the reason why I'm worried. Call me a purist, but this would worry me if somebody put in money and they had to probably go over the edge or commit suicide just because they didn't know what and to do with their money because they went completely broke after making investments they didn't understand.
Yeah. No, I mean, so a lot of these things are fundamental, right? I mean, we did a podcast with Monica Halan recently, and she was saying the same thing that, hey, we have a very buyer beware sort of a market in India, and we have to move to more of a seller beware market. Right. And, having operated entirely in startups for the last 13 years, I know, this whole credo of move fast, break things, it doesn't really translate. I mean, it's dangerous if it translates into the financial realm because, it's ultimately somebody's money at the end of the day. It's not like an app crash or, a few hours wasted. I mean, it's somebody's hard-earned savings. So what do you think, I mean, the government or, any of these agencies, quasi government agencies can do to impose greater liability on these guys?
Okay. So, I don't subscribe to the seller beware model for the simple reason that if we make that kind of pivot, which is basically a 180-degree pivot, you tend to inject further risk aversion and the like. And the need of the hour is basically not to inject risk aversion among service providers, but to enable innovation in a responsible way. So I would lean on two things. One, regulatory architecture. If you see the regulatory architecture in India, there is an ombudsman model. RBI basically houses within its domain. If you see, but RBI, because it's also the banking regulator, there is tension between consumer protection and banking regulation, right? Because they don't, you don't necessarily see the way things from consumer perspective. When you are the banking regulator, there is an inherent systemic, sort of tension between your regulatory goals and your consumer protection goals. So elsewhere, what they've done is they've created a separate agency for consumer protection. And if you look at the Indian Financial Code, which was discussed around 2013-14 in the country, 13-14, I think element of 2015 as well. We've had a document, a policy document proposing a separate consumer protection agency. This is something on the lines of, and I use it very advisedly, something on the lines of, but not necessarily identical to CFPB that we have in the US. So decoupling that and sort of enabling that through a separate regulator that is specifically charged with consumer protection would be a way to go ahead. The other thing is, demand side reforms, right? You talk about supply side reforms, but we also demand side reforms like PFM, financial education, financial literacy, and the like, that stakeholders have a natural incentive to inculcate among their users, because the higher the financial understanding is, the financial know-how as to what an option or future is, or how does a additional tier 1 bond, which was recently in news in Yes Bank context, how is it that different from a ordinary fixed deposit and the like, right? Because you see that litigation going to court, and RBI said, look, we are not going to support you. We have written that 81 off, and that's the way it'll say. You will have to take your losses. So I mean. So that knowledge, and that knowledge will come from demand side reforms, which I think the ecosystem catalyzed by regulators has to sort of take it forward, along with the regulatory architecture thing that you mentioned. Supply side reforms or sort of regulation in terms of seller beware and the like tend to have unintended consequences of the type of regulatory of innovation freeze and the like, right? Because it's sort of already in a already risk averse kind of environment. You're putting strict liability kind of framework on a bank or a financial institution or fintech. They're going to basically that's going to sort of put a spanner on innovation. In India, land of billion users, we need more innovation than less innovation. So that would be my response. The two prongs that I mentioned.
Right. So, Monica, we're operating in exceptional times, right? So how do you see fintechs being more relevant in a post-COVID world? And what can we do, let's say, to have another 100 unicorns out of India?
Actually, that will definitely happen, and it's already happening. So, anything that I say, I will be able to say I said that in 2020. So that's the good part about being in the post-COVID world. Having said that, I really think that a couple of opportunities that are definitely opening up. The edtech space has hit the roof, but rather than every company becoming a fintech company, it's important that we tend to also operate in a manner where fintech becomes so easily accessible to everybody that everybody doesn't need to build their own payment rails. I'm not saying I'm not against the idea. All I'm saying is that rather than focusing on the core proposition, if you have to focus on the ability for your revenues to be made and therefore taking away from your core function, then I think that's a distraction rather than an enabler. So fintechs in India are right now, and we've seen the last 250 fintechs come out, the Sunicorns, the unicorns, everything else come out. There is one basic element that exists across all functions. Everybody is operating in a completely unique environment. There doesn't seem to be any Me Too's. And that place where everybody was doing the same thing has suddenly gone away. And people are focusing on core propositions. But having said that, the main trends that we are seeing again are going to be on credit. And I keep saying credit, but credit in terms of being able to use the infrastructure that India is already creating, but at the same time being able to do things a lot better. And I brought up insurance tech, for example, and I'm a great fan of Monica Hallan, and she knows that. Having been a consumer of insurance, I again go back and to the main business of insurance tech, which is also to enable and give the ability for the consumers to actually take care of that insurance money and get the payouts in the same manner and make it so easy as it was to purchase an insurance product. And that has not happened. It will not happen until the arms that make it actually available through the various rungs and layers actually work together. So selling an insurance product is a lot easier because now you have marketplaces that do that. But if you ask a consumer who actually owns the insurance, what do they understand of it? The answer is nil. If you ask the insured person or persons or business as to what they need to do with insurance, the answer is they don't know. How do you renew the product? They don't know. The toolkits and the sales force enablement to be digital in a post-COVID world, no answers. And I think that's the space in which the fintechs also need to play, because payments and therefore being able to manage maintenance activities is a huge part of an insurance business. And everything right now is being done in a very archaic manner, which has been happening for the last 50 years and nothing changed. And similarly, health tech. I think where we're talking about data and we're talking about the democratization of data, we're also talking about consumer data and financial data now being equally merged, but leading to a more responsible world where we're able to use the efficacies which are created because of these, instead of unique islands operating, then coming together. But coming together in a safer environment for the consumer as well as for the provider would be better. So therefore, private-public partnership, as it happens, it needs to be open for all. If it becomes restricted where there are only one or two players operating in the environment, then again, we're going to have people who are going to push boundaries. And then it's again going to be about the whole competition that gets created and then getting them back into the mainstream, which actually takes away from the focus that we would have for innovating actually at get-go. And I personally think that as far as payments are concerned, we've still not hit that tipping point where we can say that we've actually become a less cashless nation, or a more cashless nation and hence a less cash dependent nation. I think we are right now still in that phase where demonetization happened, and then suddenly people said, "Oh, digital has hit the roof." It did, but then again the numbers didn't come down; the numbers changed. So now the question is, are we going to continue with this behavior, or are we going to fall back to our old ways? And last but not the least, we've talked about personal finance management, but it's important to consider digital financial literacy as one of the important fulcrums of how all change will happen. So fintechs who are going to operate in a space where they want their users to pay for their services should also be willing to invest in their education, and therefore making, for example, we talk about edtech, but nobody talks about life skills. Nobody talks about digital financial literacy. These are basic things that we need to cater to. And I personally think that we are going to be a better off nation after COVID. I know how it sounds completely counterintuitive, but I'm personally of the opinion that in the next 5 years, you'll have much more happening in India than in any part of the world, thanks to COVID, actually.
Yeah, fantastic. I think, as they develop more skin in the game, I think they will build out more of these things. And you can see that, right? I mean, Zerodha has been around for about 10 years now, and they have invested in their own varsity and the, education and so on and so forth. You will see others probably doing the likes. All right, thanks so much for this wonderful discussion. Good amount of optimism with just a modicum of circumspect. I think it's just perfect. So thank you, Mandar. Thank you, Monica. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was brought to you by the team at Bharat Varta. If you liked this podcast, then don't forget to share, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite platforms. We're available on Anchor, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Breaker, YouTube, and a host of other platforms. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you do wish to offer us any feedback on the content or anything else, do reach out to us on social media or get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.